His name is Chukwuemeka. He is 26 years old, a graduate of computer science from a state university in Anambra, and he is currently sitting in his uncle's provision shop in Onitsha, helping to manage the till, because 3 years after finishing his degree, he has not found a job that matches what he studied for. Every morning, he applies for roles on LinkedIn and Jobberman. He gets automated rejections most days. On the days he hears nothing, he sits in the shop and watches the price of beans go up again. Rice that his mother used to buy for 250 naira per kilogram in 2015 now costs 1,800 naira. The crate of eggs his uncle stocks went from below 1,000 to 6,000 naira. The generator they run the shop on drinks diesel that is now sold at over 1,500 naira per litre. Chukwuemeka voted for Peter Obi in 2023. He registered on the Obidient portal in May 2026 when the NDC launched it. He sent the link to 8 of his friends. 2 of them responded. What is happening to Chukwuemeka? This specific feeling of being educated, willing to work and still going nowhere is what is happening to over 40% of young Nigerians. It is the economic raw material that every serious opposition politician in this country is trying to convert into votes. And the question I want to answer today is the most important strategic question in Nigerian politics right now. Can Peter Obi, on his 3rd political platform in 3 years, actually turn Chukwuemeka's frustration into the kind of organized, voting, polling unit covering political momentum that wins a presidential election in January 2027? Before we go deeper, if you are just finding Naija News Watch, welcome. This channel exists to break down what's really happening in Nigerian politics without the noise and without the spin. If that's the kind of analysis you enjoy, hit subscribe and stay with me, because this story is about to get a lot more interesting. Let me give you the economic picture first, because you cannot understand Obi's strategy without understanding what the economy is actually doing to ordinary Nigerians right now. Nigeria's headline inflation rate in June 2026 was 15.91%. That sounds like it is easing, and compared to June 2025 when it was 25.29%, it is. But food inflation, which is what actually matters for Chukwuemeka and his uncle's shop, stood at 17.52% in June 2026, and it is still rising month on month. Crayfish, fresh pepper, tomatoes, yam flour, beef, garri, Irish potatoes, all of them went up again in June. In Kogi State, food inflation hit 53.02% year-on-year. In Niger State, 43.83%. In Benue, 40.83%. These are not Lagos or Abuja numbers that can be smoothened by imported substitutes. These are inland states where people eat what the land produces, and the land's produce has become unaffordable. Now look at wages. The national minimum wage in Nigeria is 70,000 naira per month, signed into law by President Tinubu in July 2024. With petrol averaging 1,596 naira per litre in May 2026, that entire monthly wage now buys you just 43.9 litres of petrol. And in late June 2026, just 3 weeks ago, the president's own chief of staff, Femi Gbajabiamila, stood at the Good Governance Summit in Abuja and said publicly that the 70,000 naira minimum wage, quote, must be honestly reassessed against today's realities. The IMF, in its July 2026 World Economic Outlook update, warned that higher prices for essentials in Nigeria are expected to further aggravate poverty and food insecurity. This is the economic environment Peter Obi formally entered as the NDC presidential candidate on May 30th, 2026. At the special convention in Abuja, he accepted the nomination, received the party flag, and delivered an acceptance speech that lasted over 40 minutes. On July 1st, 2026, 2 weeks ago, he released a formal document titled My Vision for a Productive and Prosperous Nigeria, spelling out his economic platform in detail. The question is not whether the economic pain is real. It is. The question is whether the man who ran in 2023 and lost, who has since been through Labour Party and the ADC, who now carries his message on an NDC platform most Nigerians did not know existed 6 months ago, whether that man can convert verified economic misery into an organized, machine-backed political movement before January 16, 2027. To understand whether Obi's economic pitch can work, you need to understand the institutional framework he is operating inside, because the rules of the game shape what economic frustration can and cannot do at the ballot box. The 25% spread requirement. Section 134 of Nigeria's constitution says a presidential candidate wins outright only if they secure a majority of all votes cast, or at least 25% of votes in at least 24 of 36 states and the FCT. This is the rule that makes economic frustration in any one region insufficient on its own. Chukwuemeka's anger in Anambra, multiplied across the southeast, can produce a repeat of the 1.96 million votes Obi got there in 2023. But to win the presidency, or even to force a runoff, Obi needs that frustration to translate into 25% of votes in northern states where he got very little support in 2023. Economic pain is universal, but converting it into organized votes in states with different political structures and cultural context is a different kind of challenge entirely. The NDC's ward structure requirement. The Electoral Act requires parties to maintain active ward-level structures across Nigeria, approximately 8,809 wards. The NDC was only registered in February 2026. It is 5 months old. To hold valid primaries and field a credible candidate that INEC accepts, it needs demonstrable ward-level presence in at least 24 states. Chukwuemeka and his friends registering on Obidient.com are part of this infrastructure effort. But digital registration and physical ward presence are two different things. A name on a portal does not send a trained agent to sit in a polling unit in Gusau or Maiduguri on election day. The Electoral Act 2026 and what changed? The amended Electoral Act mandates that result sheets from polling units are uploaded to INEC's iRev portal. This is real progress. It makes it harder to manipulate results at polling unit level without a digital trace. But as we covered in a previous video, Section 63 gives presiding officers discretion to use manual transmission if they declare a communication failure. That loophole exists, and it exists in the states where Obi is weakest. The economic pain is real. The rules for counting it cleanly are better than 2023, but not airtight. The minimum wage review and its electoral calendar significance. The NLC and TUC have formally announced plans to reopen minimum wage negotiations in July 2026. If a new minimum wage figure is agreed and announced before October 2026, it will land in the middle of primary and early campaign season. A generous wage increase would give the Tinubu administration a counter-narrative to the economic pain argument that Obi is building his entire campaign on. But a failed negotiation, or a wage that workers and their unions reject as insufficient, hands Obi the exact ammunition he needs. Watch the NLC government negotiation calendar very closely. Now let me decode what Obi is actually doing, why it is smarter than most commentary gives it credit for, and where the serious vulnerabilities still are. Layer 1, the economic message is positioned precisely where the pain is verified. Obi's acceptance speech on May 30, 2026, and his July 1 vision document hit 3 specific economic targets that NBS data confirms are real. First, unemployment. He said the official unemployment rate of 4%, quote, grossly misrepresents the true situation, and cited actual underemployment and unemployment above 30%, with youth unemployment over 40%, among the highest globally. This is consistent with published labor force data. When Chukwuemeka hears a candidate say the government-owned jobs number is a lie and the real figure is above 40% for people his age, he doesn't need to Google it. He lives it every day. Second, food production versus food affordability. He said transitioning from consumption to production through agricultural investment is the only dependable strategy for escaping hunger and poverty. In states where food inflation hit 40 to 53% year-on-year, states that are themselves agricultural, this framing lands differently than it does in Lagos. Third, electricity. He pledged a 10,000 megawatt increase in generation within 4 years. We covered the power grid crisis in a previous video. The numbers he's citing align with what energy analysts have been saying about the gap between Nigeria's installed capacity and actual generation. The policy message matches the verified problem. Layer 2, the consumption to production framework is his sharpest economic framing. This is the line from Obi's vision document that deserves the most attention. The situation in which unemployment remains high while Nigerian entrepreneurs establish businesses elsewhere because skilled labor is scarce must be confronted decisively.
This is not a slogan, it's an accurate description of a structural paradox. Nigeria has educated young people who cannot find work, while Nigerian-owned businesses in other African countries struggle to find qualified staff because those countries' education systems have not produced enough skills. The framing shifts the economic argument from Tinubu has failed, which is oppositional, to Nigeria has a structural problem that requires a different kind of leader. That's a more durable political message because it doesn't depend on economic conditions continuing to deteriorate. It works even if inflation eases slightly before January 2027. Pattern interrupt. The government's own chief of staff admitted the minimum wage is broken. This is the fact that changes the entire frame of the economic debate heading into 2027. On June 26, 2026, less than a month ago, Femi Gbajabiamila, the president's own chief of staff, stood in front of a Nigerian workers' audience and admitted that the 70,000 naira minimum wage introduced in 2024 must be honestly reassessed against today's realities. He didn't say this as a criticism, he said it as a concession.
The government that is asking for a second term had, in its own words, introduced a minimum wage that its own representatives are now describing as inadequate less than 2 years later. For Peter Obi, that statement is worth more than any speech he could give. It is the ruling party acknowledging in public that the economic pain Obi is campaigning on is real, and it happened 5 weeks ago. Layer 3, the northern economic pivot, the smart strategic angle almost nobody is covering. In his acceptance speech, Obi made a specific and deliberate reference to northern Nigeria's agricultural potential, describing the north's extensive arable land as, quote, one of the country's most valuable economic assets capable of driving growth and food security. That is not accidental phrasing. It is a strategic signal to northern voters and northern political operators that Obi's economic vision includes them. In a region where food inflation hit 40 to 53% in some states, where farmers cannot get to their fields because of insecurity, and where the cost of living crisis is as severe as anywhere in the country, framing an agricultural transformation message as a northern economic message is significantly smarter than his 2023 campaign, which was perceived in many northern communities as primarily a southern and urban project. Layer 4. The Kwankwasia Economic Bridge. Kwankwaso's political base in Kano was built substantially on a record of education and economic empowerment, school uniforms, health insurance, and youth employment under his 2 terms as Kano governor. The Kwankwasia voter is not just a political loyalist, he is someone who has directly benefited from a specific kind of state-level economic management that he associates with Kwankwaso's name. When Kwankwaso connects that economic identity to an Obi Kwankwaso ticket, he is not just delivering a voting bloc, he is delivering a community of people who have lived experience of what they consider good economic governance. For Obi, that is a more credible northern economic endorsement than any campaign advertisement could produce. Layer 5. The Vulnerability. Converting message into machine. Here is the honest assessment of where Obi's economic strategy is weakest. Economic pain motivates people to want change. It does not automatically produce trained polling unit agents, ward-level party structures, or the kind of last-mile electoral infrastructure that determines whether your candidate's votes are actually counted. Tinubu's APC has 31 governors, thousands of state and local government officials, and a federal resource base that can deploy material support to communities in the weeks before an election. Obi has a compelling message, a viral social media footprint, and a 5-month-old party. In Nigerian elections, the gap between message and machine is where elections are decided. Chukwuemeka can believe every word Obi says. If the NDC does not have a trusted agent sitting in Chukwuemeka's polling unit in Onitsha on January 16, 2026, watching the form EC8A being filled out, that belief does not get counted. Now, if what I just laid out surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know your take before we get to the part that changes the whole picture. Let me bring this back to Chukwuemeka in the provision shop in Onitsha. When Peter Obi says youth unemployment is above 40%, Chukwuemeka nods. He is one of the 40%. When Obi says the 70,000 naira minimum wage does not reflect current realities, and when the president's own chief of staff says the same thing 2 weeks later, Chukwuemeka does not need a policy brief to understand what that means. It means that even if he gets a job at minimum wage, he will not be able to afford the basic cost of being alive in Nigeria in 2026. For the trader down the road from Chukwuemeka's uncle, the provision seller buying beans wholesale at prices that have tripled in 3 years, the economic message from the NDC is not abstract, it is her daily reality. The question for her is not whether the message is true, the question is whether it comes with a plan she can believe in, delivered by a candidate who has shown he can hold a political structure together long enough to win. The economic stakes for ordinary Nigerians heading into 2027 are this. The IMF has formally warned in its July 2026 update that higher prices for essentials in Nigeria are expected to further aggravate poverty and food insecurity. The NBS data published this week shows food inflation is still rising month on month even as the annual rate eases, and the government's own chief of staff has admitted the minimum wage introduced in 2024 is no longer adequate. The economic argument for change is not being made only by the opposition, it is being made by the data. And in an election year, data that confirms lived experience is the most powerful political ammunition available. The international dimension of this economic story is real and it is fresh. The IMF's July 2026 World Economic Outlook update, published 4 days ago, contains a specific Nigeria warning. The fund stated, quote, "Nigeria is supported by improved macroeconomic stability and favorable terms of trade effects, though higher prices for essentials are expected to further aggravate poverty and food insecurity." It attributed the rise to the global energy crisis, which has driven up fuel costs worldwide, including in Nigeria, where the Middle East conflict that began in March 2026 created a fuel price shock that drove transportation costs up by 17% in May alone. The IMF is not a political actor. When it formally projects that Nigerian essential prices will worsen poverty in 2026, it is providing Peter Obi's economic argument with an independent international citation that the ruling party cannot easily dismiss. For Nigerians in the diaspora who sent over $20 billion in remittances to Nigeria in 2024, the economic situation at home is personal. When a sister in Lagos calls from a market and says beans now cost 2,800 naira per kilogram, the diaspora Nigerian in the UK understands immediately. The question for the diaspora in 2027 is whether they believe Obi has a credible economic plan, not just a diagnosis, but a program. His July 1 vision document is the first formal policy statement of his NDC campaign. The Obi supporting diaspora community will be reading it very carefully over the next few weeks. There is also a broader global pattern worth noting. In country after country where incumbent governments have implemented painful economic reforms, fuel subsidy removal, currency devaluation, wage compression, opposition candidates have successfully channeled the resulting frustration into electoral momentum, from Argentina's Milei to Kenya's post-2022 wage protests to Senegal's 2024 election. The pattern is consistent. Economic pain created by structural reforms creates a political opening for opposition messaging, even when the reforms are economically necessary. Obi is specifically positioning himself inside that pattern. Let me steelman the government's economic argument because it deserves a serious hearing. The strongest case for Tinubu's economic record. The reforms were necessary and are working. Nigeria's headline inflation fell from 34.19% in June 2024 to 15.91% in June 2026. That is a significant decline. The fuel subsidy that was removed in 2023 was costing Nigeria over 13 trillion naira per year, money that was largely captured by petroleum product importers and politically connected middlemen rather than reaching ordinary Nigerians as a genuine benefit. The naira flotation has allowed Nigeria's external reserves to stabilize after a period of unsustainable managed exchange rates. The GDP growth rate reached approximately 3.4% in 2025, driven by non-oil sector activity.
Minister Wale Edun and CBN Governor Cardoso have both cited data showing that while the reforms were painful, the macroeconomic fundamentals are improving. For a government asking for a second term, those numbers matter. The Tinubu camp's counter to Obi's economic message. Senior APC figures are making a specific argument about opposition economic credibility.
Peter Obi governed Anambra State for 8 years. During those 8 years, Anambra's GDP and internally generated revenue were respectable but not transformational. The state benefited from being relatively peaceful and commercially active, but it did not produce a manufacturing miracle or a food security revolution. Critics ask, if Obi had a production-based economic transformation plan, why was Anambra still dependent on federal allocations when he left? This argument is being circulated by APC surrogates, and it is designed to undercut Obi's credibility as a candidate who can deliver on his economic promises at scale. But here is where both arguments fall apart under scrutiny. The headline inflation decline from 34% to 16% sounds impressive until you remember that food prices are still rising month on month. The 17.52% food inflation rate may be better than 25% from a year ago, but it means every visit to the market in June 2026 is still more expensive than the visit in May. The cost of living crisis is not a perception problem or a statistical artifact. It is what the MBS data itself confirms. The government-own chief of staff confirmed it. And on the Anambra question about Obi's record, Obi governed a state with a tiny budget and no federal patronage for significant part of his tenure, during a period when his PBP was in opposition in Abuja. What he built in Anambra, particularly on education infrastructure and public financial management, was done under severe resource constraints. The comparison with a sitting president who commands 36 trillion naira from federal resources is not fair ground. The biggest misconception in the economic debate, that Nigerians vote primarily on economic data. They do not. They vote on identity, on regional solidarity, on whether they trust a candidate, and on whether they believe their vote will be counted. Economic frustration is a fuel, but it needs a vehicle to reach the ballot box. The 2023 election demonstrated this clearly. Nigeria's economic conditions in 2023 were terrible. Inflation was high, unemployment was high, the naira was weak. Yet Tinubu won, partly because his party had the machine, partly because opposition votes split across 3 candidates. Obi is betting that 2027 will be different because the coalition is now stronger and the message sharper. He may be right, but economic data alone, however damning, does not win elections. The machine does. Here are the 4 signals to watch over the next 3 months that will tell you whether Obi's economic message is converting into real political momentum. Signal 1. The minimum wage negotiation outcome. The NLC and TUC have formally announced plans to reopen minimum wage negotiations in July 2026, this month. If the government offers a new figure and organized labor accepts it as a genuine living wage improvement, it blunts Obi's economic knife. If negotiations collapse or if labor rejects a government offer as inadequate, the NLC and TUC become effectively aligned with the opposition's economic narrative heading into election season. Watch the NLC's formal statement on the government's wage offer. It will come in July or August, and its tone will tell you everything. Signal 2. The monthly food inflation numbers through October. The MBS releases monthly CPI data. Food inflation month-on-month was 3.75% in June 2026, still rising. If it is still rising at 2 to 3% month-on-month by October, the economic argument for change will be stronger in October than it is today. If it begins declining as the Middle East fuel price shock moderates and the harvest season brings new supply, the Tinubu camp gets a counter-narrative just before primary season. Watch the August, September, and October MBS releases closely. They are political events as much as statistical ones. Signal 3. Whether the NDC produces a detailed economic manifesto, not a vision statement. The July 1 document was a vision statement, principles, aspirations, and frameworks. What serious economic analysts, diaspora investors, and undecided voters are waiting for is a specific, costed, sequenced economic manifesto. How exactly does Obi plan to increase electricity by 10,000 megawatts? What is the agricultural investment mechanism, direct government spending, public-private partnerships, or land reform? What is the funding source for education reform? If an NDC economic manifesto with real specificity arrives before September 2026, Obi will be taken significantly more seriously as a governing candidate, not just a protest candidate. Signal 4.
Labour Congress endorsement or alignment. The NLC and TUC represent millions of unionized workers. They do not formally endorse presidential candidates, but they campaign, they mobilize, and their language about who is and who is not protecting workers carries enormous weight in urban industrial communities. If Labour's tone towards the NDC warms, if Labour officials start appearing at NDC events or giving interviews that praise Obi's economic positioning, it would be the most significant political development of the second half of 2026. Conversely, if Labour eventually accepts a revised wage from the government and endorses the APC's economic record, that removes one of the key credibility props from Obi's message. Best case scenario for Obi's economic strategy. The minimum wage negotiation fails or produces an offer Labour rejects. Food inflation stays elevated through September. Obi releases a specific costed manifesto before October. The NLC warms to the NDC. Northern urban voters in Kano, Kaduna, Abuja, and Maiduguri, who are experiencing the same cost of living crisis as their southern counterparts, begin to see the NDC as a credible economic alternative. The Peter Obi for President movement in 19 northern states develops visible physical presence, and Obi enters primary season with a tighter message, a broader coalition, and a more credible governing plan than he carried into 2023. Worst case scenario. The government reaches a new wage agreement that organized labor accepts. Food inflation begins to ease as the harvest season arrives. The NDC produces another broad vision document rather than a specific manifesto, and economic commentators describe Obi's program as aspirational rather than operational. APC governors in 31 states deploy state resources to community economic interventions, road openings, market refurbishments, cash transfer announcements, timed for the October to December window. And Obi enters primary season fighting the same accusation that dogged him in 2023, that he is a man with the right diagnosis but an unclear treatment plan on a platform people are not sure will hold. Let me take you back to Chukwuemeka. He's still in the provision shop in Onitsha. The beans are still expensive. His LinkedIn application tab is still open on his phone. He sent the Obidient registration link to 8 friends and 2 responded. I asked at the start of this video, can Peter Obi turn Chukwuemeka's frustration into the kind of organized voting and polling unit covering political momentum that wins a presidential election in January 2027? Here is my honest answer. The frustration is real, verified, and fresh. The government's own chief of staff has confirmed it. The IMF has projected it will worsen. The MBS publishes it every month. Chukwuemeka's experience is not perception, it is data. And Peter Obi's economic message on the evidence of his May 30 acceptance speech and his July 1 vision document is better targeted, more regionally aware, and more structurally coherent than his 2023 campaign. But economic frustration has never, on its own, been enough to win a Nigerian presidential election. What converts frustration into votes is organization, ward structures, polling unit agents, trained observers, coordinated logistics on election day. In 2023, Obi had the movement but not the machine. In 2027, Kwankwasia provides a machine in the north. The Obidient movement, more mature and more disciplined than in 2023, provides the sentiment in the south, and in cities, the NDC provides the legal platform. Whether those 3 elements, sentiment, structure, and platform, hold together legally and operationally through 8 months of political pressure is the question this video cannot answer. Only January 2027 can answer it. What I can tell you is this: the economic conditions for Chukwuemeka to want change are there. The man making the case for that change has the clearest economic message of his political career, and the clock is running. What do you think? Can Obi's economic message break through in the north, where the pain is deepest but where his organizational challenge is hardest? Drop your take in the comments. I genuinely want to hear it. If this breakdown gave you clarity on what's really going on, do me a favor, share it with one person who needs to understand this. Like the video, subscribe to Niger News Watch, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp.